Miriam Joelle Graves was 41 years old, and for 3 years she had fed a stranger on her front porch every Tuesday and Friday without asking his name. She drove a 12-year-old Civic with a slow leak in the rear left tire. She worked double shifts at the county health clinic and kept a second job on weekends managing intake at a veterans transitional shelter 2 miles east of her house. Her neighbors on Clover Lane called her a saint, and she shook her head whenever they did. Her daughter Zara, 9 years old and sharp as river glass, called her Mama and meant it like a whole theology. The man had first appeared on a November evening, sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the street, his coat too thin for Memphis in late fall. Miriam had been carrying groceries in from the Civic, and she had stopped and asked him if he had eaten. He said he had not. She made him a plate of red beans and rice and set it on the porch railing without ceremony, and he ate without looking up, and when she came out later the plate was clean and stacked neatly at the base of the railing like it had been left by someone who understood the gravity of borrowed kindness. He came back that Friday. For 3 years, that was the shape of it. He never asked for money. He never lingered past dark. He never knocked on the door. He sat on the porch steps or on the wall and ate whatever she brought him, and sometimes he said thank you in a voice like gravel settling into still water, and sometimes he said nothing at all, and Miriam never asked him what had happened to bring him here. Because she had worked long enough in transitional housing to know that the story always came when the person was ready and not 1 minute before. She had no idea that the man eating her red beans and rice on a plastic folding chair had once managed a $47 million commercial real estate portfolio. She had no idea that his silence was not absence. It was accumulation. What happened on Christmas morning would change everything she thought she understood about the boundaries between kindness and consequence. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in low and cold through the kitchen window that Miriam's father had reframed the summer before he died. She had never replaced the original glass, single pane and slightly rippled, because when the winter light moved through it at a particular angle, it made the kitchen floor look like the bottom of a shallow river. And she found that beautiful in a way she could not explain to anyone who hadn't loved someone and then lost them. She made coffee the way her grandmother had taught her, pressing the grounds down slow, not forcing it. Her grandmother, Cleo May, had told her once, standing at a stove very much like this one in a kitchen, very much like this one in a house 2 streets over where Miriam had grown up, "Baby, you cannot pour from a vessel that has a hole in it. You patch the hole first. Then you pour." Miriam had been 16 and thought she was talking about the old percolator. It had taken her another 20 years to understand what Cleo May had actually meant. Zara was still asleep. It was Christmas morning, and Miriam had wrapped 3 gifts with newspaper and ribbon the night before. Practical gifts, a new backpack, a book she had been hunting at second-hand stores for 4 months, a small set of colored pencils, and a tin. And she had set them under the spindly little tree she and Zara had cut from the lot on Beale, and decorated with paper chains and old buttons, because they were their own kind of people, and their own kind of beautiful. The house was hers. She had made the last payment on it 14 months ago, a 3-bedroom on Clover Lane that she had bought for $68. 12 years earlier when the neighborhood was considered marginal and the inspector had found 2 things wrong with the foundation. She had fixed both herself, hiring a structural mason she trusted and standing beside him the whole 3 days, learning she knew every inch of this house the way some people knew scripture, by repetition and by reverence. The porch she had rebuilt herself 2 summers ago, board by board, treating the wood before she laid it, spacing the decking for drainage, countersinking every screw. The neighbors had watched. She had offered no explanation. The work was the explanation. She had met Marcus, Zara's father, at the clinic where she worked, years ago, when he came in for a routine examination before a job placement. He had been funny and attentive, and had a way of asking questions that made her feel actually seen, not evaluated. They had been together 3 years before she understood that his attentiveness was not a character trait, but a strategy. That the questions were not curiosity but reconnaissance, and that the man who had made her feel seen had been, the entire time, looking for an angle. He left when Zara was 2, before Miriam could leave him, which she had been preparing to do, and took $11,000 from their joint account on his way out. She did not chase the money. She changed the account. She raised the child. She had not been with anyone since. Not for lack of opportunity, for lack of patience with performance. The years after Marcus had not been bitter. That was the thing people misunderstood about Miriam Graves. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued from her own life. She was a woman who had looked at the structure of her situation, assessed it honestly, and decided to build it into something that could stand on its own without leaning on anything temporary. She had done that with the house. She had done that with the clinic work. She had done that with Zara, who was turning out to be a person of real and specific quality, and whose personhood Miriam considered the most significant work of her life. There were hard months. There were weeks when the slow leak in the Civic's tire felt like a metaphor she was too tired to argue with. But she had never confused difficulty with defeat, because Cleo May had taught her the difference early, and she had paid attention. The man on her porch she had started calling Henry, in her head, because she needed to call him something, and he had the bearing of a Henry, quiet and structural, like a load-bearing wall. She noticed, in the 2nd year, that he did not smell the way she expected. He was worn, but he was clean. His nails were trimmed. Once, in spring, she had brought out a plate of chicken and collards, and noticed he was reading a book, a dense one, and he had folded the page corner down carefully before he took the plate. She did not look at the title. Some things were not hers to read. The first sign that something was shifting had come in October, 3 months before Christmas, when a man she had never seen, a younger man, well-dressed, driving a car that didn't belong on Clover Lane, had slowed in front of her house and looked at the porch for a long moment before driving on. He did not stop. He did not speak, but he had looked at Henry, who was sitting at his usual spot, and Henry had looked back, and something had passed between them that was not surprise. She had gone inside and told herself it was nothing. That had been the first thing she planted in herself that she did not yet know would matter. The knock came at 9:47 on Christmas morning. Miriam was standing at the stove turning sweet potato hash, and Zara was still in bed reading the book she had unwrapped an hour earlier, already 40 pages in, already unreachable by the ordinary world. The knock was 3 beats, measured, unhurried. Not the knock of someone cold or frightened. The knock of someone who had decided. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel that had been her grandmother's and went to the door. The man on her porch was Henry. But he was not the Henry she had known. He wore a coat that fit him properly. Dark wool, clean and pressed, and beneath it a shirt with a collar and dark trousers and shoes that had been recently polished. He stood straight in a way she had not seen before. Not because he had been incapable of it, she understood now, but because he had not chosen it. Beside him stood a woman in a gray blazer carrying a leather document case, early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that assessed a room the way a surveyor assessed land. Calmly, completely, without rushing. Miriam looked at Henry. Henry said, "I owe you something." His voice was the same. Gravel settling into still water. She let them in because Cleo May had raised her to let people in when they arrived with that particular weight in their eyes, the weight of something long carried and finally set down. They sat at the kitchen table, all three of them. Zara had heard the door and padded out in her socks, and Miriam had sent her back to her room gently with the promise of pancakes in 20 minutes, and Zara had gone, trailing the book. The woman in the gray blazer said her name was Patricia Hollins, and that she was a licensed estate attorney with an office downtown. She set the document case on the table, but did not open it yet. Henry said his name was not Henry. His name was Elias Dewitt Crandall. He was 53 years old. He had been for 22 years a real estate development manager specializing in mid-tier commercial acquisition and renovation in the Mid-South region. He had built and managed a portfolio that at its peak was assessed at $47 million. He had done it from nothing, starting as a maintenance technician at a mall property management company in 1993, reading every contract that crossed his desk, asking questions other people considered beneath them, taking classes at night at a community college until he had a business degree and then a real estate license and then, eventually, a firm with his name on it. His wife had left him 3 years ago and taken, through a combination of forged signatures and a business partner who had been her lover for 2 years before Elias discovered it. $3 million in liquid assets and driven his firm into a bankruptcy proceeding that had taken everything else with it. The partner, a man named Stovall, had been her instrument and her architect. The scheme had been running for 19 months before it surfaced. Miriam listened without speaking. Elias said he had not been homeless in the way she might have imagined. He had an apartment. He had enough to eat. But he had lost the architecture of his life, the meaning structure of it, the reason to be in any particular place at any particular time. And in that first November he had found himself walking, just walking. The way you walk when sitting still feels like a form of agreement with everything that has been done to you. He had passed her porch on a Tuesday evening, and she had asked him if he had eaten. He said, "You didn't treat me like a project. You didn't ask me to explain myself. You gave me food, and you let me be a person." He had kept coming because it was the one place in those 3 years where nothing was required of him except to receive. And receiving, just receiving, without negotiation, without suspicion, without debt, had turned out to be the thing he had not known he needed to learn. Miriam's hands were flat on the table. She was very still. Patricia Hollins opened the document case. In the 31 months since the bankruptcy proceeding had begun, Elias had worked with 2 attorneys, a forensic accountant, and a business fraud investigator. He had rebuilt his cash reserves slowly, working as a property assessment consultant under contract, living lean, and spending every discretionary hour on the legal reconstruction of what had been taken. The forensic accountant, a man named Bryce who had spent 20 years as a federal auditor before going private, had taken 6 weeks to map the full scope of the scheme. The picture he produced was clinical and complete. Over 19 months, Stovall had used his co-signature authority on the firm's operating account to route $1, $3 million through 3 shell entities he had registered in a separate state. Elias's former wife had served as the registered agent of 2 of them. Her signature on documents she had told Elias were routine vendor agreements. The transfers had been timed to coincide with the firm's quarterly close cycles, when the books were dense and the line items were many. It was patient, methodical work. It was the kind of scheme that required someone with industry knowledge, access, and no conscience at all. When Bryce had laid the timeline out in front of Elias across a conference table in Patricia Hollins's downtown office, Elias had looked at each page without speaking. His hands had not moved. His expression had not changed. Patricia had watched him and noted it the way you note something important. She had been a lawyer for 28 years, and she had sat across from people receiving terrible news for all of them, and she could tell the difference between a man suppressing grief and a man who had already done his grieving and arrived, now, at something steadier and more durable. Elias was the second kind. Patricia had said, "We have enough to pursue both criminal referral and civil recovery. The question is sequencing." Elias had said, "Start at the beginning. Don't skip steps." She had appreciated that. She had noted it. The criminal referral had gone to the district attorney's office 14 months ago. The DA had declined on the state charges, but referred to federal prosecutors, who had more appetite for the financial instrument violations embedded in the scheme. Federal charges had been filed against Stovall 9 months ago. The case had moved with a deliberate pace of federal proceedings, which felt slow to everyone except Elias, who had grown to understand that pace as a feature, not a defect. Slow meant thorough. Thorough meant durable. He had learned that from buildings. Stovall had been convicted on 2 counts of business fraud 8 months ago and was awaiting sentencing. Elias's former wife had settled a civil suit in October for $890,000 in restitution, a number that represented roughly 68% of the liquid assets taken, which was, as Patricia put it without emotion, better than most people recovered. The firm was not gone. It was restructured. 2 properties that had been held in a separate trust, a trust she had not known about, because Elias was his father's son and his father had told him never put everything in the same drawer, had never entered the bankruptcy estate. Those 2 properties had appreciated. They were now worth, together, assessed at $1 million. There was a particular morning, in the second year of the proceeding, when Elias had sat in the parking lot outside the consulting office where he worked and looked at his hands for a long moment. They were the same hands. He had used them to sign every contract that built the firm, and he had used them to document every transaction that unmade it. And now, he would use them to build again. He started the car. He drove to the office. He reviewed 3 property assessments and billed 4 hours, and called Patricia at 5 o'clock to ask where they were on the discovery timeline. Preparation was the work. There was no substitute. Elias was relaunching. He had already signed 2 new acquisition contracts. He had an office again, a small one, on Main Street. Patricia slid a document across the table. Miriam looked at it without touching it. It was a letter of gift. Formally executed, notarized, legally binding. It conveyed to Miriam Joelle Graves the sum of $74,000, structured as follows: $40,000 outright, no conditions, representing, per the letter's language, what Elias had calculated as the compound value of the meals she had provided over 3 years, multiplied by what he called the actual conversion rate of human dignity, a number he had arrived at by his own accounting, and which he was prepared to defend to anyone who asked. The remaining $34,000 was held in a designated education trust for Zara to be released at the time of her enrollment in any post-secondary institution. Miriam read the letter twice. She read it the way she read things that mattered, not for confirmation of what she expected, but for what she might have missed the first time. She said, "I didn't do this for money." Elias said, "I know that. That's what makes the money mean something." He had thought about this for a long time. He had thought about it on long evenings in his apartment when the legal work was done and the city outside his window made its ordinary nighttime sounds. He was not trying to purchase anything. He was not settling a debt, not exactly. He was trying to do what the law had done for him at its best: create a record. A document. Something that said, "This happened, and it mattered, and the evidence of its mattering is here, in writing, with witnesses." Patricia said, There's no obligation, no strings, no conditions on the outright portion. It's yours to do with as you choose. There was a second document. It was a deed of property assessment, completed and signed by Elias personally, identifying 3 structural improvements Miriam had made to the Clover Lane property, including the porch, and certifying them at a total value add of $22,000 to the home's assessed price. This document had been prepared, Patricia noted, in case Miriam ever chose to refinance or sell, so that her work would be recorded and recognized. Miriam touched the edge of this one. She looked at the line where Elias had noted the porch specifically. The dimensions, the material grade, the estimated labor hours, the value adjustment. He had done this from memory and from a professional eye, trained across 22 years of looking at structures and reading what they said about the people who built them. She understood what it meant that he had looked at her porch and seen it the way she had always wanted it to be seen. Some things you don't announce. You document them instead. Miriam Joelle Graves sat at her grandmother's kitchen table on Christmas morning and looked at the 2 documents for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried when Marcus took the money. She had not cried at her grandmother's funeral, not at the graveside. Not until 11 at night a week later when she was alone in her kitchen and the particular angle of the lamplight caught the old percolator on the counter. And then she had cried for a long time in the quiet way you cry when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. And you put it down, not because you chose to, but because your body decided for you. She did not cry now either. But she was quiet in a way that meant something. She said, "You didn't have to do this." Elias said, "I know." He said, "That's why." Patricia Hollins closed her document case with the clean efficiency of a woman who had been in many rooms where important things happened and had learned not to perform for any of them. Miriam asked if they would stay for coffee. Patricia said she had another appointment, but thank you. Elias said he would. Zara came back out 20 minutes later for her pancakes and found a man named Elias sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee from her grandmother's mug, talking to her mother the way adults talked when they were not performing for each other, but actually speaking. And she sized him up with the swift intelligence of a 9-year-old who had been raised by a woman who saw things clearly, and she sat down and said, "Are you the porch man?" Elias said he was. Zara said, "Mama makes good food." Elias said, "She does." 7 months later, the porch on Clover Lane had a new chair on it. Not a plastic folding one, but a solid wooden one with a curved back that Miriam had found at an estate sale and stripped and refinished herself one Saturday while Elias sat on the steps and handed her tools, and they talked about the properties he was rebuilding and the reading curriculum. She had helped design for the shelter's intake program and the particular way the light came through the old kitchen window in winter. The $40,000 had paid off the remaining debt on Miriam's Civic, eliminated the balance on a medical bill she had been managing for 2 years, and put the remainder into a savings account she had not had before. She had not told her neighbors where the money came from. It was not their story. Zara's education trust sat at the bank, growing slowly, patient as good wood. What had happened to Stovall was this. He received a sentence of 4 years in a federal facility south of Nashville and lost his real estate license permanently. The firm he had built with the assets taken from Elias had collapsed inside 18 months, as firms built on other people's foundations tend to do. His name in Memphis real estate circles had become, quietly and completely, a closed door. Elias's former wife had relocated. Someone had seen her working in an administrative role at a property management company in a smaller city 2 states away. And when that news had reached Elias through a mutual acquaintance, he had listened, noted it, and gone back to the contract he was reviewing. He did not speak of her with bitterness. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. On a Sunday in August, Miriam sat in the new chair on the porch with her coffee while the morning came in over the oak tree at the edge of the yard. An oak tree she had planted herself when she first moved in. A seedling then, now taller than the roofline, rooted deep and wide in the particular way of things given enough time and enough ground. Elias's car was in the driveway. He was inside, reading to Zara from a book about the history of architecture, a subject Zara had recently decided she was interested in. With the focused certainty of a child who has not yet learned to doubt her own curiosity, Miriam held the coffee in both hands and listened to his voice through the screen door and watched the light move through the oak's leaves, the way light moves through anything that has earned its height. Cleo May had told her once that a patch wasn't a flaw. A patch was evidence that someone had paid attention. She thought she understood it differently now, more fully. The way you understand most true things, not all at once, but in accumulation, over time, in the quiet space between what you give and what returns to you, changed. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.